Having been blessed with sight for all of our lives, we can only imagine what it would be like not to be able to see at all. And maybe when we were younger we played games, maybe we closed our eyes and we put our hands over our face to mimic what it might like not to have sight. But that's hardly the same thing. No matter how long we choose to keep ourselves in the dark, we have the option to open our eyes and visually reconnect with the world around us. When we read of the blind man in this morning's gospel proclamation, we realize how very different it must have been for him. His blindness was not a temporary choice. It was something he was born with and had to live with, and there was no apparent end to his handicap. Seen against this background, the story of Bartimaeus invites us, you and me, to see our lives in a whole new and different way. Whether we are looking with our eyes, our hearts, or our minds. And in this respect, we can view life in three possible ways. First, we may react like the crowd did in the gospel. Second, we are invited to be like Bartimaeus. And third, we are called to be as Jesus was in this morning's gospel. First, to be like the crowd. What would it be like to be the crowd? We are told that the crowd was very upset with Bartimaeus. St. Mark tells us that they scolded him. They told him to shut up and be silent, not to make waves, to let it go and let it alone. When we read this part of the story, all of a sudden we see Bartimaeus as an icon, as an image, as a model for all of us and for our society, because we have seen the likes of Bartimaeus in many other places than Jericho. He has cried out to his God from the streets of our own cities and towns. He has pleaded in the bodies of those who are deprived of seeing justice for themselves and for their families and for their children. All these type of people who cry out and want change in society are going to be people that are going to upset everything in the world because they are insisting that things have to change. You know, there are some people who want to see what you and I see because we have many gifts that God has given us. But they are deprived of seeing the things and using the same gifts that we use, not because of their economic condition, but because of their race or their sexual orientation or the diseases that they have, or maybe how they look and how they act and how they dress, or any number of excuses why society uses against them for pulling the curtain of darkness over the life of somebody else. They cry out from time to time, and unless it is very convenient for everybody else around them, for society in general, they are told to shut up. They are told to leave it alone. Just be patient and realize these things happen. And change takes a lot of time. And to chill out and wait. St. Mark doesn't name any particular person in the crowd, but I bet you can imagine that at times their names are us. Their names are us. And you know, that story continues even in our own day. Just recall the recent tragic death of Corey Jones. Now, many people will say, you know, this happens all the time. Things always happen. Just take it easy. Just leave it alone. Just sit down, sit back, ignore it. Things will change. They don't want to they don't want to upset the apple cart. But you know, this just cannot be an acceptable solution for dealing with the issues in our lives. This cannot be an acceptable way for dealing with justice, because justice guarantees us fairness and equality. And remember the original meaning of that word, justitia. It means nothing more than equality and fairness for all people. There are no finger pointings, there are no blames, there are no arguments, there are not any incendiary devices in dialogues between groups. If you remember that the statue of justice bears two scales, and she's holding those scales in perfect balance, but she is blindfolded, so she can't see who might be to blame and who to point the finger at, because it is fairness and justice and equality for everybody. So second, maybe we're called to be like Bartimaeus. Well, first of all, if this gospel story needs to be proclaimed and rest in our hearts, Bartimaeus had to do three things. First, had to admit that he could not see. And secondly, he had to be persistent in his desire to see what he had not yet seen. And thirdly, he had to do something about it. He had to get up and move from the place to which he had become so accustomed. I joke with Episcopalian and Anglicans and say how great it is to be in our comfortable pew. How great it would be to have those wonderful security blankets around us as we sit and worship each Sunday without any demands. And how if the church were filled with only two people, one visitor and one longtime Episcopalian sitting in that pew, that visitor would be in that person's pew, and the Episcopalian would come and say, "There's no place for me to sit in church. I'm going to go home. Someone's sitting in my pew." We get so comfortable from the days of those old pew rents. Bartimaeus had to get up and do something and move from the place which he had become accustomed. Now, whether we're talking about blindness of the eyes, blindness of the heart, or blindness of the mind, those who do not know that they are blind will never be able to see. It has been said that the most enslaved person in the world is that person who thinks that he or she is free, but is not, because they live in darkness. And by the same token, there are none so blind as those who think that they see when they do not. If we believe that we have seen all there is to see about each other, then we will never come to know each other as we are. Many broken relationships attest to that fact of life. If we believe that our eyes of faith have already discovered all that there is to know about God, then the God who is will forever be a stranger. Many in the time of Jesus were convinced that they knew all about Messiah. They not only missed him, they killed him. If we are convinced that we already see all that really matters in our lives and in society and in our nation and in reality, not virtual reality, but true reality, then we stand condemned to miss so very much. History is scattered with those who would now look at the realities which have unfolded down through the ages right before their eyes. Realities that are so clear to all, but those who refuse to see. Unfortunately, the areas which make the major differences in our lives and in our society and in our church are the very ones in which we are so reluctant to admit to our blindness. when as individuals, or as nations, or even as faith communities called the church, we act as if God had already filled our minds with the truth, then we deprive ourselves of ever seeing truth as it is. We condemn ourselves not even to know what it is to be able to see. We condemn ourselves to blindness. Whether it be of the eyes, or of the heart, or of the mind, blindness is blindness is blindness. And it can only be healed in those who do not look into the darkness and insist that it is light. Bartimaeus not only recognized that he was blind, he was persistent in his efforts to see. He was not a man to stay blind because everybody else around him, all his peers, wanted it that way. St. Mark tells us that he shouted out for the mercy of Christ. He shouted out, not an easy thing to do. How many people have refused to shout out and stand up and make a noise when tragedies such as Blacksburg, Virginia, Jacksonville, Florida, Aurora, Colorado, Newtown, Connecticut, Charleston, South Carolina, Ferguson, Missouri, Fort Hood, Virginia Tech, and all those recent church burnings in St. Louis, and even more recently, the death of a 4-year-old child because of road rage, and countless others down to our own Delray Beach and Boynton Beach neighborhoods. There needs to be a change in our lives from blindness to sight, and we need to get up and shout out as Bartimaeus did. Not an easy thing to do. Searching for the sight of truth is not an exercise for the timid. The tide will often be against you and against us as clergy and against the church. Ask those who dare to speak out against the war in the Persian Gulf. They were told to shut up or be branded as unpatriotic. Witness those who struggle to see their way to sobriety or free themselves from other addictions, among those others who stand to gain from their disease and from their addictions. Anyone who has ever ventured from darkness to light knows the difficulty of disappointment, rejection, and ridicule. The Wright brothers knew that. Thomas Edison knew that. So often the things that we see and even take for granted have been brought to light by someone before us who would not stop shouting out, who would not stop looking. The move from darkness to light, from blindness to sight, is hardly ever a one-step process, because real sight, again, does not belong to the timid, but only to those who will do what it takes to pull back that curtain, regardless of the objections from without, from society, or even the fears that live within our hearts. You see, learning to see is synonymous with leaving that to which we have become so accustomed, that comfortable pew. It is to believe, as Bartimaeus did, that the sight God would give him was far better than the blindness with which he had so long identified. This morning, in the sacrament of holy baptism, Benjamin Fleming will take a step from darkness into light through the witness of his parents and godparents and through all of us, his extended spiritual family. Benjamin will choose light. He will choose to see through the eyes of faith, and he will make the decision that the sight which God will give him this morning will be far better than any blindness he could ever live with without this holy sacrament of baptism. And that same God continues to hold out new sight to all of us and to those who can admit to the blindness that holds them, who can persist in the search of something new while letting go of that with which they have become so accustomed. And now to be like Jesus. There is one more consideration before we leave today's gospel story. Not only do we fall vulnerable to acting as the crowd who attempted to silence Bartimaeus, not only are we invited as he was to see something new, we are often called to be as Jesus was in today's gospel. We are called to invite others out of their fears that keep them from seeing. And this does not mean that we manipulate them to see things our way, but rather that we encourage them to see new things. It means that we reach out to them to help them trust their own desires to see more, and that we invite them past their own fears and obstacles. This is what Jesus did for Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus certainly had his obstacles, but Jesus called him past those fears. So perhaps the choice you and I have to make this morning, often in this regard, is whether we're going to respond as the crowd responded or as Jesus did. And finally, if we listen very closely, then you and I, too, will hear that same Jesus inviting you and me, as he did Bartimaeus. You see, each of us might actually say that today's Holy Gospel is the story of Bartimaeus and us. And yet, that remains for each of us, for you and me to determine. Will we open our eyes and see or not?